The rain fell on Paris with a quiet intensity, not the violent rage of a summer storm, but the persistent melancholic whisper of a city confessing its secrets. Each drop that traced a path down the thick armored glass of the Rolls-Royce seemed to carry the weight of a memory, blurring the grand facade of the building across the street into a watercolor of gray and gold. From his throne of hand-stitched leather in the back seat, Julian Vance watched the headquarters of his life's work, the Maison Vance, and felt nothing but the profound weariness of a king who had grown tired of his crown. At nearly 70, the lines on his face were a testament to a life of ruthless ambition and exquisite creation. They were maps of boardroom battles, one of fabrics sourced from the farthest corners of the earth, of nights spent sketching designs that would define an era of fashion. But lately the map felt less like a triumphant chart and more like a faded parchment, its territories conquered and its adventures exhausted. The fire that had forged an empire from a single audacious idea had dwindled to a pilot light, and all he craved was the quiet comfort of embers. His driver, Antoine, a man whose silence Julian had valued for over 20 years, finally broke it. "Monsieur Vance, it is nearly 4. Shall I wait, or would you like to proceed to the residence?" Julian's gaze remained fixed on the golden cursive V that adorned the archway of the building. "A few more minutes, Antoine. I am reflecting." Reflecting was a gentler word than what he was truly doing, which was wrestling with the ghost of his own legacy. In 3 days, the annual shareholders' meeting would convene. It was a formality, a performance he had perfected over decades. But this year was different. This year, he would announce his successor, his nephew Elias. The thought should have brought him peace. Elias was sharp, ambitious, with a modern sensibility that Julian, in his more honest moments, admitted he no longer possessed. Elias spoke the language of social media engagement and disruptive marketing, of metrics and analytics that made Julian's head spin. He was by all accounts the future. Serafina, his fiancée and the company's creative director, was the perfect counterpart, beautiful, impossibly chic, with an artist's eye and a shark's smile. Together they were a power couple poised to launch Vance Atelier into a new stratosphere. They assured him of this constantly, their voices smooth with the practiced reverence one uses for a living monument they are eager to place in a museum. So why did the prospect feel less like a peaceful abdication and more like a surrender? He thought of his late wife Eleanor. It was she who had seen the artist beneath his businessman's armor. She had been the soul of his first collection, the whispered inspiration behind every stitch. Since she was gone, the vast echoing penthouse they had shared felt less like a home and more like a mausoleum for a life already lived. Elias and Serafina were his only family now. They managed his schedule, his diet, his social engagements, all under the guise of caring for his well-being. They were insulating him, they said, from the stresses of the modern world. Julian suspected they were simply ensuring the monument did not step off its pedestal and interfere with their plans for the museum's renovation. "It is a miserable day, monsieur." Antoine set his eyes meeting Julian's in the rearview mirror. "A coffee would warm these old bones. With your permission, there is a small cafe just there. I will be no more than 5 minutes." "Of course, Antoine, take your time." The quiet click of the door and Antoine's retreating footsteps were swallowed by the rain, leaving Julian in a cocoon of insulated silence. He closed his eyes, the scent of leather and his wife's lingering perfume, a custom blend he still had made, though she had been gone for 5 years, filling his senses. He was drifting lost in a memory of a sun-drenched afternoon in their garden, when a sudden impossible chill jolted him awake. He was not alone. The air in the car had changed. It was heavier, charged with a presence that hadn't been there a second ago. His eyes snapped open. In the seat opposite him, a small figure was huddled, dripping water onto the pristine lambswool carpet. It was a girl no older than 10, with a thin, smudged face, and eyes that were far too old for it. They were the color of moss after a storm, and they held a fierce, watchful intelligence. Her clothes were a ragged collection of grays and browns, a stark, brutal contrast to the opulent cream and walnut interior of the car. For a moment, Julian was too stunned to react. Security was absolute. The car was a fortress. How had she? "Don't call for him," she whispered, her voice barely a sound, yet it cut through the silence with the sharpness of a shard of glass. She nodded toward the empty driver's seat. "He won't see me. No one ever does." Julian's mind, a machine honed by decades of high-stakes negotiation, finally engaged. He didn't reach for his phone. He didn't raise his voice. He He simply watched her, his posture unchanged, his hands resting on his knees. "That is a rare talent," he said, his own voice a low, calm rumble. "But it does not explain how you came to be in my car." The girl ignored the question. Her gaze was intense, burning with an urgency that was almost frightening. "You are Julian Vance," she stated. It was not a question. "You are going to give everything to them, the nephew and his snake woman." The crude but accurate description of Serafina sent a jolt through him. "I am preparing for a transition, yes." He chose his words carefully. "You are preparing to die," she countered, her voice raw. "A real death is quiet. They are planning a loud one for you, for your name." A cold dread, unfamiliar and unwelcome, began to seep into Julian's bones. This was no ordinary street urchin. This was something else entirely. "Who are you?" he asked, his voice losing its calm edge. She reached into the pocket of her frayed jacket and pulled out a small folded object. With small, deliberate fingers, she unfolded it and held it out to him. It was a scrap of fabric, a piece of silk no larger than his palm. It was ancient, the color of a midnight sky, and embroidered on it was a single exquisitely rendered flower. Julian's breath caught in his throat. He felt the world tilt on its axis. He didn't need to touch it to know what it was. The texture, the impossible depth of the black dye, the unique seven-petaled design of the bloom. It was from the Black Orchid, the centerpiece gown of his very first collection. A dress that had shattered the conventions of Parisian couture and launched his empire. A dress of which only one was ever made. It had been Eleanor's. It was buried with her. "Where did you get this?" His voice was a choked whisper. The girl's old eyes filled with a profound sadness. "It was my mother's. It was all she had left of her soul." She leaned forward, the scent of rain and cold pavement filling the small space between them. Her whisper was so faint he had to strain to hear it over the drumming of the rain on the roof. "They are selling your soul, not just your company. The ghost of the Black Orchid will not forgive you." The words struck him with the force of a physical blow. The ghost of the Black Orchid. It was a phrase Eleanor had used, a private joke between them. The true inspiration for the collection was a secret they had guarded fiercely. It was born from a shared dream, a personal tragedy, a story of love and loss that was woven into the very fabric of the company's DNA. It was the soul of Vance Atelier. And for this child, this impossible phantom who had appeared from the rain to speak those words, he reached out his hand, trembling not for the fabric but for her. "Wait, tell me who your mother was. Tell me—" But she was already moving. With the same spectral silence with which she had appeared, she slipped toward the door, her small hand finding the handle. "Don't trust them," she said, her moss-green eyes locking with his one last time. "The ink on the contract is poison. The pretty flowers hide the deepest roots." And then she was gone. The door clicked shut so softly he might have imagined it. Julian lunged forward, pressing his face against the cold glass. He scanned the rain-swept sidewalk, the bustling crowds huddled under umbrellas. Nothing. It was as if she had dissolved back into the storm that had produced her. He sank back against the leather, his heart hammering against his ribs. His hand was still outstretched. On the carpet where she had been sitting was a small damp patch, and next to it, the folded square of black silk. He picked it up. The fabric was cool against his skin, yet it seemed to burn him. He ran his thumb over the embroidered orchid, the thread still perfect after more than 40 years. This was real. This had happened. Antoine returned, shaking his umbrella, a small paper cup in his hand. "My apologies, monsieur. The queue was longer than is everything all right. You are very pale." Julian looked at his driver, at the familiar, loyal face he had trusted for 2 decades. And for the first time he wondered, who could he trust? If the deepest secret of his heart, a secret he believed had died with his wife, could be spoken by a ghost in the rain, what other truths lay buried? What other lies had he been telling himself? He clenched the piece of silk in his fist, the delicate embroidery pressing into his skin. The weariness he had felt just minutes before was gone, replaced by a surge of cold, terrifying energy. The monument had just been shaken to its foundations, and he had a dreadful feeling that the museum was about to become a battlefield. "Antoine," he said, his voice hard as stone, "take me home, and cancel all my appointments for tomorrow. I have some research to do." The penthouse was a universe of glass and steel suspended high above the slumbering heart of Paris. It was a space designed to command awe, with floors of Italian marble that mirrored the ever-changing sky and walls adorned with art that represented not just wealth, but a predator's instinct for acquiring the priceless. For 5 years since Eleanor's passing, it had been a silent, beautiful tomb. Tonight, for the first time, Julian Vance felt it was a cage. He dismissed the nightstaff with a quiet wave of his hand, the lie of a headache coming easily to his lips. Alone, he walked through the grand salon, his footsteps echoing in the cavernous space. Serafina had redecorated after Eleanor was gone, replacing the warm velvets and rich woods with a palette of sterile whites, chrome, and brutalist concrete. She called it a clean, forward-facing aesthetic. Julian now understood it for what it was: an erasure. They had been systematically erasing Eleanor, and by extension him, from his own life long before he had ever noticed. In the sanctuary of his private study, the one room he had forbidden Serafina to touch, he locked the heavy oak door. The air here was different, thick with the scent of old books, aged whiskey, and the faint floral memory of his wife. He walked to the massive mahogany desk that had been his father's and switched on the green banker's lamp. The soft glow illuminated the space, a haven of controlled chaos against the curated emptiness of the rest of the apartment. He laid the scrap of black silk on the desk blotter. Under the lamplight, the embroidered orchid seemed to absorb the light, its 7 petals possessing a depth that felt almost alive. His mind flew back over 40 years to a small, cluttered apartment in the Latin Quarter, the air thick with the smell of charcoal and cheap wine. He saw Eleanor, her fingers a blur of motion, her brow furrowed in concentration as she stitched the first prototype. The black orchid wasn't just a design. It was their secret language. It represented a promise made on a desperate night, a symbol of a sorrow they had shared and transformed into beauty. No one knew its true meaning. No one was left alive who knew, except it seemed for a 10-year-old girl with the eyes of a forest spirit, and a mother who had once owned a piece of his soul. The next morning, the gilded bars of his cage became terrifyingly apparent. He awoke to find Chloe, his new personal assistant, a sharp, efficient young woman, hand-picked by Serafina, waiting with a tray. "Good morning, Monsieur Vance," she chirped, her smile perfectly polished. "Serafina was concerned about your headache last night. She prepared a special anti-inflammatory infusion for you, and she and Elias have taken the liberty of clearing your schedule for the day so you can rest before the big week." Julian looked at the steaming cup. It smelled of turmeric and ginger. He smiled faintly, the mask of the weary patriarch slipping easily into place. "How thoughtful of them. Thank you, Chloe." He accepted the cup, but set it aside untouched. His mind was racing, clearing his schedule. It was a gentle imprisonment. He spent the morning feigning lethargy, watching the intricate machinery of his isolation at work. When he asked Chloe to retrieve a file from the corporate archives, she politely informed him that Elias had already digitized everything he might need and moved the physical files to an off-site facility for security. When an old friend from his early days in the business called, Chloe intercepted it, promising sweetly that Monsieur Vance will return your call as soon as he is feeling stronger. The call was never put through. They were cutting him off from his past, from anyone who might remind him of the man he used to be. Just before noon, Elias and Serafina arrived, their faces masks of loving concern. Elias, handsome and dressed in a suit so perfectly tailored it seemed a second skin, clasped Julian's shoulder. "Uncle," he said, his voice resonating with false warmth. "We were so worried. You must not overexert yourself. Everything is handled. The Omnicorp deal is flawless. All you need to do is rest and lend us your wonderful presence at the signing." Serafina drifted into the room like a couture phantom, placing a cool, dry kiss on Julian's cheek. She carried a sleek white binder. "I brought you the executive summary of the agreement," she said, her voice like honey laced with ice. "Just the key points so you don't have to trouble yourself with the tedious legal jargon. It's a triumph, Julian. Your legacy secured for the next century." She placed the binder on the table beside him. Julian felt a cold fury rise in his chest, so potent it almost choked him. The condescension was staggering. They treated him not as the architect of the empire, but as a senile figurehead to be managed and placated. He forced a weak smile. "Thank you, my dear. You both think of everything." He picked up the binder, his hand feigning a slight tremor. "It is a great deal to take in. My mind isn't what it used to be." It was a test. He saw a flicker of triumph in their eyes, a shared glance that lasted less than a second but confirmed everything. They believed he was broken. "That is why we are here, Uncle," Elias said smoothly, "to carry the burden for you." After they left, leaving behind the scent of expensive cologne and the suffocating weight of their ambition, Julian moved with a purpose he had not felt in years. He waited until he heard Chloe leave for her lunch break. Then he went back to his study. Behind a false panel in the bookshelf, nestled amongst first editions of Proust and Voltaire, was a small steel safe. Inside, untouched for a decade, were relics of a more analog life, a passport under a different name, a few bundles of foreign currency, and a simple, outdated Nokia phone with a prepaid SIM card. He switched it on. The small screen glowed to life, a beacon in the encroaching darkness. Now for the contract. The summary Serafina had provided was an insult, a children's picture book version of a document that would decide the fate of his company. He needed the real thing. He summoned Chloe back to the penthouse with a call to her mobile, his voice deliberately frail. "Chloe, my dear, a foolish old man's sentimentality. I find myself wanting to read the full agreement, every word, for old time's sake, to feel the weight of my life's work one last time." He could hear the hesitation in her voice, quickly masked by professional concern. "Monsieur, it's over 300 pages. Serafina insisted you shouldn't—" "Indulge me," Julian said, injecting a note of pathetic pleading. "It would mean a great deal to me. Please, have the full document package sent over from the office. I won't trouble anyone with it. I just want it here with me." It was a gamble. He was betting on their arrogance, on their belief that he was too weak and dim-witted to comprehend what he was reading, let alone act on it. An hour later, a courier delivered a heavy leather-bound portfolio. Chloe placed it on his desk with the careful reverence of a nurse handling a potentially hazardous object. That night, Julian waited until the entire penthouse was still. The city lights glittered below a silent audience to his private drama. With the Nokia in his pocket and the silk fragment lying beside him like a talisman, he sat at his desk and opened the portfolio. The air grew heavy as he read. For hours he navigated the dense forest of legalese, his old sharp mind cutting through the undergrowth of subclauses and indemnification waivers. The summary Serafina had provided was not just an oversimplification, it was a masterful work of fiction. He found the clauses buried deep within Section 9, subsection C. They were written in the dry anodyne language of corporate law. The new entity post-merger shall reserve the right to conduct a full review of all existing brand assets. Reserves the authority to restructure, consolidate, or retire legacy collections, deemed non-essential to future market strategies. To optimize brand synergy and eliminate redundant creative IP. Retire legacy collections. Eliminate redundant creative IP. It was a death sentence. It wasn't just about money. It was a license to gut Vance Atelier of its history, its identity. They could discontinue the heritage lines, sell off the archives, and transform his life's work into a soulless mass-market machine churning out handbags and sneakers with a V stamped on them. Lena's words echoed in his mind. "They are selling your soul." He felt the rage now pure and white-hot, but beneath it was a profound and chilling shame. How had he let this happen? How had he become so blind, so complacent, so willing to be cocooned in comfort, that he had failed to see the vultures circling his own legacy? Eleanor would have seen it in an instant. She would have gutted them with a single, well-placed word. He closed the heavy binder. The evidence was clear. The warning had been true. He was utterly alone, surrounded by enemies disguised as family. But not entirely alone. From his desk drawer, he retrieved an old leather-bound address book, its pages soft with age. He flipped through the faded ink until he found the entry he was looking for. The name was written in his own hand from a time before digital contacts and corporate directories. Arthur Pendleton. His finger traced the number. Arthur had been more than his head of security. He had been a friend, a man of unwavering integrity, who had been unceremoniously forced into early retirement by Elias 2 years ago. The reason given was corporate restructuring. Julian, in his fog of grief and detachment, had allowed it to happen. He saw now it was the first move in their long game, removing the Queen's most loyal knight from the board. With a hand that was now perfectly steady, Julian picked up the Nokia. He walked to the vast window, the city sprawling beneath him like a galaxy of fallen stars. He dialed the number. The phone rang once, Twice. A third time. Julian's heart pounded. Had the number been disconnected? Had he waited too long? Then a voice gravelly and cautious came through the line. Yes, Arthur. Julian said, his voice low and urgent. It's Julian Vance. I am in trouble, and I need your help. There was a long pause on the other end of the line, a silence so profound Julian could hear the blood rushing in his own ears. Then the voice came back imbued with a loyalty that had not faded with time. I've been waiting for this call for 2 years, Julian. Tell me where and when. The cafe was a relic from a version of Paris that was rapidly disappearing. Tucked away in a cobblestone alley on the Ile Saint-Louis-le-Sablier d'Or was a place of dark wood tarnished brass and the comforting aroma of burnt sugar and strong coffee. It was a place for hushed conversations, not for Instagram posts. Julian had chosen it precisely because it belonged to the past, a time when loyalty was a currency he understood. Arthur Pendleton had not changed. He was a man carved from granite, his face a landscape of stoic lines and quiet integrity. He sat nursing a small cup of espresso, his posture straight, his eyes scanning the cafe with the ingrained, effortless vigilance of a man who had spent his life guarding secrets. When Julian entered, a subtle nod was the only acknowledgement that passed between them. Julian slid into the worn leather of the booth. For a moment they sat in silence, two old soldiers meeting on a forgotten battlefield. You look tired, Julian, Arthur said, finally, his voice a low gravel. I have been asleep, Arthur. Julian replied, his voice heavy with self-recrimination. And the waking world is a harsher place than I remember. He recounted the events of the past 48 hours, from the phantom in his car to the poison ink in the Omnicorp contract. He spoke quietly, his words precise, laying out the facts without emotion. When he finished, he placed the small square of black silk on the table between them. Arthur looked at it but didn't touch it. The black orchid, he murmured. I remember the night of the launch. Eleanor wore it. She outshone every star in Paris. He finally met Julian's gaze, and in his eyes was a deep, resonant anger. I warned you, Julian, not in so many words, but I tried to warn you about the boy. My nephew Julian stated the word tasting like ash. Tell me what you know. Arthur reached down and lifted a worn leather briefcase onto his lap. He opened it and pulled out a single thick dossier bound in plain black. He pushed it across the table. This is why I was retired, he said. It began small. Inflated expense reports on Serafina's creative budget. Vendor contracts for marketing firms that didn't seem to exist. I started digging. Elias was building a network, a shadow company running parallel to Vance's atelier. He was using shell corporations in Panama and the Cayman Islands to siphon funds. Julian opened the dossier. Inside were spreadsheets, bank transfer records, photographs of Elias meeting with men who looked more like gangsters than businessmen. It was meticulous, damning, and utterly horrifying. I took this to Elias. Arthur continued, his voice flat. I thought, perhaps foolishly, that he was being manipulated, that he didn't understand the depth of it. He smiled, told me I had a vivid imagination, and thanked me for my diligence. A week later, I was offered a retirement package so generous it was clearly hush money tied to an ironclad non-disclosure agreement. He told me you had personally signed off on it, that you felt my methods were becoming antiquated. The shame hit Julian with the force of a physical blow. He had signed it. He remembered the paperwork, the brief conversation with Elias about Arthur deserving a peaceful retirement. He had been so wrapped in his own grief he had simply waved it through. He had betrayed his most loyal friend without a second thought. I am sorry, Arthur, he said, the words inadequate. Don't be sorry. Be angry, Arthur countered, his voice hard. He used your grief as a shield. Now what is our next move? This dossier can wound him, but the girl, she holds the dagger that can pierce his heart. We need to find her. Finding a ghost in a city of millions should have been impossible. But Arthur Pendleton was a master of the unseen world. He did not use technology. He used the city's nervous system, the street vendors, the concierges, the old women who watched the world from their apartment windows. He started at the Vance building, showing a discreet, memorized sketch of Lena's face. For 2 days they found nothing but whispers and dead ends. Julian felt a growing desperation. Had she been a hallucination, a figment of his own guilty conscience? But the silk fragment on his desk was real. The fraud in Arthur's dossier was real. On the 3rd day, a lead emerged. An old man who sold roasted chestnuts near the Pont Neuf recognized the description. A quiet girl, always with a book. She didn't beg, she just watched. He thought he had seen her going into the Bibliothèque Sainte-Geneviève, the grand public library. They found her in the main reading room, a vast, vaulted cathedral of knowledge. She was curled in a worn armchair in a forgotten corner, a thick volume of Dumas resting in her lap. She looked smaller here, surrounded by towering shelves of books, a tiny island of fierce concentration in an ocean of silence. Julian approached her alone, his footsteps soft on the ancient parquet floor. He sat in the chair opposite her, waiting patiently. After a few minutes, she looked up, her moss-green eyes, showing no surprise, only a quiet evaluation. "You believe me now," she said. Julian nodded slowly. He reached into his pocket and placed the silk fragment on the small table between them. "This belonged to your mother. You said it was all she had left of her soul. I need you to tell me why." The girl Lena closed her book, marking her page with a careful finger. For a long moment, she studied his face, searching for the truth in the lines of his exhaustion and newfound resolve. Then she began to speak, her voice a low, steady murmur that seemed to draw all the quiet of the library around them. "My mother's name was Isabelle Moreau," she began. "She was a designer, the best designer in the world. She came to work for you a long time ago. She was young, and she thought she had found a home at Vance Atelier." Julian's mind strained, reaching back through the fog of years. Isabelle Moreau. The name was a faint echo. He remembered a face now pale and serious, framed by a cascade of dark hair eyes that burned with a quiet fire. A junior sketch artist, incredibly gifted. She had worked under his brother Robert Elias's father. She loved fabric. Lena continued, her voice taking on a dreamy quality. "She said it had a language, that it could tell stories better than words. She created something for you, a collection. She called it the Black Orchid." Julian felt the blood drain from his face. "That's not possible. The Black Orchid it was inspired by my wife." "Your wife was the muse," Lena corrected him gently. "My mother was the artist. She worked with you and your wife for months. She showed me the pictures. The three of you in the design studio, covered in charcoal and fabric scraps. You were happy then." The memory, sealed away for decades, broke open. It was true. He remembered now. Isabelle, the shy prodigy. Robert had brought her to him, boasting of his discovery. She had worked tirelessly, translating his and Eleanor's abstract ideas into breathtaking form. She was the one who had perfected the 7-petaled orchid, who had sourced the impossible black silk from a single family of weavers in Lyon. After the collection was a sensation. Lena's voice grew colder, losing its childish softness. "Your brother told her that her work was done. He said the collection was now the property of the Vance family. He gave her an envelope with some money and told her that if she ever spoke of her contribution, the company would ruin her. She would be blacklisted. She would never work in Paris again." Robert, his charming, feckless, ambitious brother who had lived his life in Julian's shadow and died of a heart attack 5 years after Elias was born. Julian had always known Robert was jealous, but he had never suspected this depth of cruelty. He had been so consumed with the success, the expansion, the building of the empire, that he had never looked back. He had let Robert handle the personnel details. He had let Isabelle Moreau disappear. "What happened to her?" Julian asked, his voice hoarse. "He broke her," Lena said simply. "She left Paris. She tried to work elsewhere, but the story followed her. No one would hire her. She raised me on her own, telling me stories of the beautiful things she had made. She taught me how to draw. She told me that one day the world would know the truth." Lena paused, taking a shaky breath. "She got sick last year. The doctors said it was her lungs, but I know it was her heart. It was just tired of being broken." Lena then reached into her worn satchel and pulled out an object wrapped in oilcloth. She placed it on the table with a reverence that was heartbreaking to watch. It was a leather-bound sketchbook, its cover cracked and its pages yellowed with age. "She told me to keep this safe," Lena whispered. "She said it was my inheritance, the only thing of value she had left to give me." With trembling hands, Julian untied the string and opened the book. It was like staring into the heart of a supernova. Page after page was filled with designs of staggering genius. Here was the original hand-painted concept for the Black Orchid gown, annotated with Isabelle's elegant, precise script. Here were the initial sketches for the entire collection, each one more breathtaking than the last. But there was more. dozens of other designs concepts for entire collections that had never seen the light of day, a line inspired by celestial cartography gowns that seemed spun from starlight, a collection based on the bioluminescence of deep-sea creatures using fabrics and techniques Julian had never imagined. It was a treasure map to a future that Vance Atelier had been denied. It was the stolen soul of his company. He looked up from the book, his eyes blurred with tears he did not know he was shedding. He looked at the small, fierce girl sitting opposite him, the orphaned daughter of a genius he had allowed to be destroyed. The betrayal was not just his nephew's. The rot had started generations ago. It had started with his brother. It had started with him. "Lena," he said, his voice thick with an emotion he couldn't name. It was grief and rage and a terrible clarifying shame. "What do you want?" Lena looked at him, her gaze unwavering. "My mother's name," she said. "I want you to give her back her name." In that moment, Julian Vance knew this was no longer a battle for a company. It was a war for redemption, and he would burn his own empire to the ground to see it won. Their apartment was an argument against nostalgia. Perched atop a starkly modern building in the 16th arrondissement, it was a minimalist expanse of polished concrete black steel and vast panes of glass that framed the city like a piece of abstract art. There were no photographs, no sentimental trinkets, no clutter of a life lived. It was a space designed for two people who saw the past, not as a foundation, but as a ruin to be cleared away. Elias Vance stood before one of these windows, a glass of dark red wine in his hand, staring down at the distant illuminated form of the Eiffel Tower. Even in silhouette, he was the picture of modern royalty, tall, lean, with a face that seemed sculpted by a dismissive god. But his posture was tight, a knot of resentment coiled in the set of his shoulders. "He's stalling," Elias said, his voice a low growl that vibrated with frustration. "I can feel it, canceling his appointments, asking for the full contract. It's the ramblings of a fading mind, perhaps, but it's an inconvenience." Serafina Dubois emerged from the shadows of the hallway, a wraith in white silk. She moved with a liquid grace that belied the diamond-hard core of her ambition. She came to stand beside him, her reflection a pale ghost next to his dark form in the glass. "Patience, my love," she murmured, her voice a cool balm on his irritation. She placed a hand on his arm, her touch light but proprietary. "Let the old lion have his final sentimental prowl. It makes our narrative all the more convincing." The beloved uncle lost in his memories, sadly unfit to steer the ship. The concerned family stepping in to save his legacy from his own decline. It's tragic. It's perfect. His legacy, Elias spat, turning from the window. The handsome planes of his face were contorted by a lifetime of simmering envy. "It's all anyone ever speaks of. Julian Vance the visionary, Julian Vance the legend. I have given 15 years of my life to that company. I brought it into the digital age while he was still sniffing fabrics and talking about emotional resonance. Yet in their eyes, I am still just the regent, the placeholder for a king who refuses to die." This was the wound Serafina had so expertly cultivated. Elias's father, Robert, had been the lesser brother, a man of moderate talent and major insecurities, who had withered in Julian's brilliant shadow. Elias had grown up with the second-hand bitterness, a prince in exile in his own kingdom. He didn't just want the company. He wanted to obliterate the myth of its creator, to finally stand on ground that was entirely his own, even if he had to salt the earth behind him. "And you will," Serafina said, her fingers tracing the tense line of his jaw. "When this is done, the name Vance will mean you and only you. Julian will be a footnote, a sad story we tell at galas about the burdens of genius." She saw her own father's face in the reflection, then superimposed over the glittering city. A man of bold ideas and foolish pride, a textile magnate who had dared to challenge the elder Vance, Julian's father, in the 60s. He had been ruined, systematically dismantled by a competitor who was more ruthless, more cunning. Her family had lost everything. She grew up with the ghost of that failure, with a name that was whispered with pity in the circles she desperately wanted to conquer. Her revenge was not the hot-blooded act of a moment, but a cold architectural masterpiece constructed piece by piece over years. Marrying Elias, the weak link in the Vance dynasty, had been the cornerstone of that design. "Show me the report again," she said, her voice shifting, becoming all business. Elias's mood brightened the prospect of concrete action soothing his bruised ego. He led her to a large, stark white table where a single tablet lay. He tapped the screen and a medical document appeared dense with clinical terminology. Dr. Albin's final evaluation, Elias said with a predator's smile. Progressive cognitive decline, mild paranoia, memory lapses consistent with early onset dementia. He notes Julian's increasing fixation on the past and resistance to new strategic initiatives. He strongly recommends a full transfer of executive authority to a trusted family member to avoid any potential fiduciary harm to the company. Albin is a true artist, Serafina said, admiring the tapestry of lies. The doctor was a man with expensive tastes and a flexible morality, a debt she had acquired and now owned. The board will have no choice but to accept it. Once the Omnicorp ink is dry, Julian's signature will be the last relevant act of his life. After that, he is just a man with a condition to be cared for and regretfully ignored. Her gaze was cold, analytical. She had no room for sentiment. Vance Atelier was to her an engine, a powerful, valuable, but woefully outdated machine. Julian and his talk of soul and heritage were like a Luddite throwing a wrench in the gears of progress. Omnicorp is ready, Elias confirmed, swiping to another file. Their liquidation analysts have already drawn up the plans. Phase 1, retire the heritage lines. The archives will be sold at auction. Phase 2, rebrand. Vance becomes VNC, a global lifestyle brand. More accessible, more profitable. No more ridiculously expensive hand-stitched nonsense for a handful of dowagers. No more ghosts. Serafina added softly, a faint, cruel smile playing on her lips. She thought of the story Elias had told her, a family legend about the secret inspiration behind the Black Orchid. Some sentimental nonsense about Julian's wife. Serafina intended to shred that myth along with the dusty dresses in the archives and weave a new legend with herself at the center. Is there any risk? Elias asked, a flicker of his father's insecurity showing through. Pendleton. He was loyal to Julian. Are you sure he is no longer a threat? Serafina laughed, a sound like ice cubes clinking in a crystal glass. Arthur Pendleton is a dinosaur. He thinks the world is one with loyalty and honor. I gave him an NDA that could bankrupt him and his entire family if he so much as whispers the word Vance to a journalist. He is neutralized. And who else is there? All of Julian's old guard are gone, retired, or pushed out. The staff worships you. His new assistant reports every breath he takes to me. He is utterly, completely alone. He is an island and the tide is coming in. She was so certain, so confident in the architecture of her plan that she failed to notice the smallest of details. The almost imperceptible flicker of the small black audio device tucked deep beneath the marble overhang of her desk, a tiny digital ear listening to every word planted there by a ghost she could not have conceived of in her most paranoid nightmares. Elias, emboldened by her confidence, refilled their glasses. He raised his, the deep red of the wine looking like blood against the stark white of the room. To the future, he said, his voice now steady, regal. To a new empire. To the end of an old one, Serafina corrected him, touching her glass to his. The clink was a sharp, final sound in the sterile air. She looked past him through the vast window at the distant, sparkling city. For a moment, her gaze fell upon the grand illuminated dome of the Bibliothèque Sainte-Geneviève. She felt a brief, inexplicable shiver, a cold draft in the perfectly climate-controlled room. She dismissed it as nothing, a stray thought. Her mind was on the final steps, the perfect choreography of the coming days. The signing, the board meeting, the press release announcing Julian's dignified retirement, the quiet transfer to a care facility in the Swiss Alps. Every detail was planned, every contingency accounted for. She was the architect of shadows, and her masterpiece was nearly complete. He truly has no idea what is about to happen. Elias mused, a note of wonder in his voice. Serafina turned back to him, her eyes glittering with a cold, triumphant light. She allowed herself a true smile, a rare expression that was all sharp edges and beautiful danger. Old lions, she said, her voice a purr that could strip flesh from bone, should learn that the most dangerous place in the jungle is the one where they feel most safe, their own den. They drank their wine oblivious to the fact that the old lion was not sleeping. He was awake, he was listening, and he was gathering his pride for one final devastating hunt. The safe house was a place that smelled of history. It was a bookbinder's workshop on a quiet street behind the Pantheon, a space Arthur had secured from a client whose secrets he had once protected. The air was thick with the scent of aging paper leather and the sharp, clean aroma of binding glue. Towering presses stood like silent iron sentinels, and shelves overflowed with the spines of forgotten books. It was a world away from the sterile gloss of Serafina's apartment, a place where things were not erased but preserved and given new life. Here, under the warm, low-hanging light of a single lamp, the three unlikely conspirators gathered around a large wooden work table. The evidence was spread between them: Arthur's dossier, a testament to methodical patience; Isabel's sketchbook, a beacon of stolen genius; and now the audio file from the device Lena had retrieved that morning. Arthur connected a small speaker to his phone. She retrieved it an hour ago. He said, his gaze resting on Lena with a profound, gruff respect. It recorded for 12 hours before the battery died. Let's see what our architects of shadow have been building. He pressed play. Serafina's voice filled the workshop, a sound so cool and precise it seemed to lower the temperature of the room. They listened in grim silence to the conversation Julian already knew in his soul, but had not yet heard with his own ears. They heard the casual cruelty in their discussion of his cognitive decline, the clinical precision of their plans to liquidate his life's work, the chilling finality in Serafina's reference to old lions needing to die. Julian sat motionless, his hands clasped on the table, but Lena saw the knuckles turn white. She watched his face, seeing the mask of the weary patriarch crumble in this safe space, revealing the raw wound of betrayal beneath. The words were a venomous tide, and he was letting it wash over him, letting the poison fuel the fire he would need for the battle ahead. When the recording ended, a heavy silence descended. "So," Arthur said, his voice a low rumble, "the motive is clear. Elias wants the throne. Serafina wants revenge. The weapon is the Omnicorp contract, and the justification is your manufactured incompetence." He looked at Julian. "They are supremely confident. That is our greatest advantage. They do not expect a fight. Then we shall give them a war." Julian said, his voice quiet, but imbued with a new, hard-edged authority. "They believe they are playing chess against a feeble king. They will not see the rest of the pieces moving until it is too late." The plan they formulated was one of delicate threads and calculated risks. Julian's role was the most dangerous. He would not only continue his performance but amplify it. He had to become the man they imagined him to be: confused, sentimental, and ultimately malleable. "There is a dinner," Julian said, his eyes distant. "Tonight, at the penthouse. It was Serafina's idea. A quiet family evening before the signing. It is a final assessment. They will be watching my every move." "It's a trap," Arthur stated flatly. "Of course it is," Julian agreed. "And I will walk into it willingly. I will be frail. I will be forgetful. I will talk of the past. By the end of the night, they must be utterly convinced that I am a relic ready to be placed in a museum." Lena, who had been listening with an unnerving stillness, finally spoke. "When a predator is sure of the kill," she said, her voice echoing the wisdom of a life spent observing from the shadows, "it grows careless. It no longer checks the wind." A grim smile touched Arthur's lips. "Out of the mouths of babes." He turned to Lena. "Your part is done for now, little one. It is too dangerous for you to go back inside." "They won't be looking for me," Lena argued, a stubborn fire in her eyes. "They don't see me. I can—" "No." Julian interrupted, his voice firm but gentle. He reached across the table and placed his hand over hers. "You have already risked more than enough. You have given us the truth. Now it is our turn to use it." The dinner was a masterclass in psychological warfare. The penthouse, which had felt like a cage, now became Julian's stage. He allowed Chloe to help him dress, fumbling with his cufflinks, asking her twice what the occasion was. He entered the salon with a slow, slightly shuffling gait, leaning on a cane he did not need. Elias and Serafina were waiting, radiant and predatory. "Uncle, you look wonderful," Elias boomed, striding forward to guide him to a chair as if he were an invalid. "Tired, Elias, very tired." Julian sighed, sinking into the plush sofa. "So much paperwork. My head spins." Throughout the meal, a culinary masterpiece he barely tasted, they performed their roles with reptilian perfection. They spoke of the future of VNC, their rebranded vision for the company. They talked about new markets in Asia, about collaborations with influencers, about a world of fast fashion and disposable luxury that was anathema to everything Julian had ever built. And he listened, nodding vaguely, a placid, vacant smile on his face. The test came during dessert. Serafina, her face a perfect portrait of sympathetic concern, placed her hand on his. "Julian," she said, her voice soft as silk. "Elias and I were discussing the archives, the old collections. They take up so much valuable space. And with your health, we feel it might be time to consider their future." Julian looked at her, his expression one of mild confusion. "Their future? They are the past, my dear. They are the company's heart." "Exactly," Serafina agreed smoothly. "They are history, and history belongs in a museum, or perhaps with collectors. We were thinking of a grand charity auction, perhaps at the Louvre. The Eleanor Vance collection. Imagine the press. All the proceeds would go to a foundation in her name. It would be a beautiful final tribute to her taste, which was of course very much of its time." The blow was so precise, so exquisitely cruel, that for a horrifying second, Julian felt the mask crack. Of its time. The casual dismissal of the woman who had been the sun in his universe. He felt the rage surge, a white-hot, primal scream that clawed at the inside of his throat. He wanted to leap across the table to shatter her perfect porcelain face, to expose her for the soulless parasite she was. His hand tightened on his wine glass, the crystal groaning under the pressure. He felt a bead of sweat trace a cold path down his temple. He saw Elias and Serafina exchange another of their fleeting, triumphant glances. They had seen it. They were waiting for the outburst, for the irrational anger that would prove their medical reports correct. He held their gaze. Then slowly, deliberately, he let out a long, theatrical sigh. The tension in his hand relaxed. He gave them a watery, sentimental smile. "A foundation for Eleanor," he said, his voice thick with manufactured emotion. "What a beautiful thought. Yes, a beautiful thought. She would have liked that. A final tribute." He brought a trembling hand to his eye, as if wiping away a tear. "You children are so good to an old man. So very good." He had done it. He had taken their sharpest blade and fallen on it, playing the part so perfectly that he had turned their weapon back on them. The triumph in their eyes solidified into certainty. The game was over. They had won. "Of course, Uncle Elias," said, his voice patronizing. "We only want what's best for you and for the company." When Julian returned to the bookbinder's workshop late that night, the performance fell away the moment the door closed behind him. He slumped into a chair, the emotional exhaustion hitting him like a physical weight. Arthur poured him a generous measure of whiskey without a word. "They believe it," Julian said after a long silence, his voice raw. "They are convinced I am a doddering fool. Then the stage is set," Arthur said, his expression grim. He gestured to the small speaker on the table. "While you were playing your part, I was listening to the rest of theirs." He pressed play. They listened to Serafina's voice once more, this time in a call to her contact at Omnicorp. They heard her laugh as she described Julian as a tragic relic. They heard her confirm the final meeting to sign the contract 3 days from now in the main boardroom. And then they heard the final chilling detail. "The medical intervention team will be on standby," Serafina's voice said, cool and detached. "The moment the ink is dry, Dr. Albin will make his official recommendation. Elias will assume emergency conservatorship. Julian will be on a private flight to Switzerland by evening. It will be quiet, humane, and irreversible." Julian closed his eyes. It was worse than he had imagined. They weren't just planning to oust him. They were planning to make him disappear. He opened his eyes and looked at Arthur, then at Lena, who had been watching him from the corner, her young face a mask of solemn understanding. The unseen threads were no longer invisible. They formed a hangman's noose, ready to be tightened around his neck. "For 3 days. Julian said, his voice devoid of all weakness, replaced now by the cold, hard clarity of a man with nothing left to lose. "Then they have 3 days to enjoy their victory, because on the 4th day we will dismantle their world piece by piece." The game, as it entered its final stages, became one of ghosts and whispers. Their strategy relied on moving through the unseen cracks of their enemy's world, a world so polished and self-assured it had forgotten to check for shadows. "The audio is damning," Arthur stated, his voice a low rumble in the quiet of the bookbinder's workshop. "But it is her word against a child's recording. In a courtroom they could tear it apart. We need something undeniable, something visual." Julian looked at Lena, a knot of conflict tightening in his chest. She sat perched on a high stool, her small face serious, watching them with an unnerving calm. The risk is too great, Arthur. She has done enough. I can do it, Lena said, her voice clear and without a trace of fear. She slid off the stool and stood before them, her posture straight. I know the building now. I know the cleaning staff's schedule. I know which corridors have no cameras. She has a sculpture on her credenza, a thing of twisted black metal. It has hollow spaces. A camera would be invisible there. Her perception was astonishing. She was not just a brave child. She was a natural operative. The years of forced invisibility had honed her senses into weapons. Julian saw the resolve in her eyes, the same fire he had seen in her mother's, and knew that arguing would be fruitless. It would also be an insult. This was her fight as much as it was his. All right, Julian conceded, his voice heavy. But Arthur will have you on a communications link the entire time. The moment he says to abort, you leave. No arguments. Is that understood? Lena nodded once, a sharp, decisive motion. The plan was set for the following afternoon. Arthur, calling upon a favor from a disgruntled former IT technician at Vance Atelier, would trigger a ghost in the machine, a system-wide server error that would send the building's tech support scrambling to the main server farm in the sub-basement. Crucially, it would also temporarily disable the security monitoring on the executive floor's private elevator, creating a blind spot. It would give Lena a window. 10 minutes, perhaps 15 if they were lucky. The next day, tension hung in the workshop like a thick fog. Julian paced the floorboards, the agonizing helplessness of a general, forced to watch a battle from miles away eating at him. Lena, in contrast, was a picture of calm. She sat at a table meticulously sketching a design from her mother's book, her focus absolute. At precisely 2:00 p.m., Arthur's phone buzzed. The alarm is triggered. He set his eyes on a laptop displaying the building's security schematics. It is responding. The executive elevator feed is down. The window is open. Lena, are you ready? Lena tucked a final stray piece of hair into her simple cap and looked up. In her hand was a tiny object no bigger than a button, with a micro-adhesive backing a state-of-the-art surveillance camera. Ready, she said. The narrative shifted, focusing on the small figure moving with practiced speed through the bustling Paris streets. Lena was a gray smudge in the city's vibrant palette, unremarkable and therefore invisible. She entered the Vance Atelier building not through the grand front entrance but through a service door, her timing perfectly synchronized with a delivery of floral arrangements. In the chaos of carts and boxes, no one gave the small girl in the drab coat a second glance. She found the executive elevator, its small screen dark as Arthur had predicted. The ride to the top floor was a silent, swift ascent into the heart of the enemy's territory. The doors opened onto a corridor of white marble and unnerving quiet. The air was cool and smelled of expensive antiseptic perfume. It was Serafina's world. Lena's heart was a small, frantic drum against her ribs, but her movements were fluid and sure. She walked past Elias's office, its glass walls revealing an empty chair. She reached Serafina's door, a formidable slab of frosted glass. It was unlocked, as Arthur's source had assured them it would be during a server crisis, when staff were moving between floors. She slipped inside. The office was a shrine to its owner's aesthetic. A vast white desk, utterly clear of clutter, seemed to float in the center of the room. A single perfect white orchid sat in a minimalist vase. On the credenza behind the desk stood the sculpture she had noted, a chaotic tangle of black, sharp-edged metal, a monument to beautiful cruelty. Lena moved quickly, her worn sneakers silent on the plush white carpet. She pulled a small stool from under a side table, her mind a focused point of light on her single task. She climbed up her small fingers, finding the hollow space she had identified from her previous visit. She peeled the backing from the camera and pressed it firmly into the dark recess. The lens was perfectly positioned to capture the desk, the chair, and the large computer monitor. She was just stepping down when she heard it, the soft, distinctive chime of the private elevator arriving on the floor. Panic, cold and sharp, lanced through her. The diversion wasn't supposed to end this quickly. She hadn't heard a word from Arthur. Her eyes darted around the room. There was nowhere to go, no corner to hide in the room's brutal minimalism. Except one. A tall, seamless closet part of a built-in storage unit stood against one wall. With a desperate, silent scramble, she reached the closet and pulled the handle. The door opened with a faint hydraulic hiss. She slipped inside, pulling it shut just as the sound of heels clicking on marble reached the office door. The closet was dark and smelled of Serafina's perfume and the faint chemical scent of dry-cleaned clothes. Through the thin, vertical slit where the door met the frame, Lena had a sliver of a view. She saw Serafina stride into the room, her expression a mask of irritation. "Incompetent fools," Serafina muttered, tossing her handbag onto the desk. "An entire floor of tech geniuses, and they can't handle a simple server reset without a building-wide meltdown." She sat down at her desk, her back partially to the closet, and powered on her monitor. Lena held her breath, trying to make herself smaller to melt into the darkness. In the workshop, Julian and Arthur watched the feed from the newly planted camera flicker to life on the laptop screen. They saw Serafina's back, heard her muttering. "She's in the closet." Arthur breathed, his face grim. "The comms are audio only. She can't hear me tell her to get out." On the screen, Serafina initiated a video call. A man's face appeared on her monitor, balding and severe, with cold, intelligent eyes. It was Dr. Alban. "Is there a problem, Serafina?" he asked, his voice tinny through the laptop speakers. "Our final consultation is not for another day." "A slight change of plans." Serafina said, her voice dropping to a conspiratorial hush. "I am moving up the timeline. The signing is still in 2 days, but I want your team ready to move the moment it is done. I don't want him having a single night to reflect. He has been acting sentimental. I want it clean." "My team is always ready," the doctor assured her. "The documentation is prepared. The moment you give the word, I will file my official medical opinion with the board's legal counsel." "Good," Serafina said. Then, with a chillingly casual air of pride, she added, "Let me show you how convincing your work is." She opened a file on her computer. The document filled the screen. From her hiding place, Lena couldn't read the words, but she saw the letterhead Center Medical Alban. And she saw the name at the top of the page, Vance Julian. In the workshop, Julian leaned forward, his face inches from the screen. He was watching a live feed of his own medical execution. He could see the forged brain scans, the fabricated test results, the clinical damning language that painted him as a man whose mind was crumbling. "It is a work of art," Dr. Serafina said with a satisfied smile. "Utterly believable. Utterly tragic." The call ended. Serafina stood up, stretched like a contented panther, and walked toward the window, her back now fully to the closet. It was the only chance Lena would get. Mustering every ounce of courage, Lena pushed the closet door open, a silent inch at a time. She slipped out a tiny shadow in a vast white room. She moved on instinct, keeping the massive desk between herself and Serafina. She reached the office door, her hand closing around the cold steel handle. She glanced back. Serafina was still at the window, lost in her triumphant view of the city. Lena slipped out of the office, closing the door with a click that sounded as loud as a gunshot in her own ears. She didn't run. She walked her pace measured and calmed down the marble corridor into the waiting elevator and down into the heart of the bustling, oblivious city. An hour later, she was back in the workshop, wrapped in a thick blanket, sipping a cup of hot chocolate that Julian had made with his own trembling hands. The adrenaline had faded, leaving her pale and quiet. On the laptop, Arthur had saved the video file. The visual proof. Irrefutable. He had also been busy. "While our little spy was in the field," he said, his voice full of admiration, "I followed the money. The offshore account we found made a recent transfer, 7 million euros, a down payment on the Chateau de Courcelles. Serafina was buying it under a holding company. She was planning to be the queen of her own castle built on the ashes of yours." Julian looked from the incriminating video to the brave, exhausted child in front of him. He felt no triumph, only a cold, clarifying sense of purpose. The game was no longer about defense. It was no longer about survival. He knelt in front of Lena, taking the warm cup from her hands. "Isabelle Moreau," he said, his voice thick with an emotion that was part rage, part reverence. "She did not just give you her genius, little one. She gave you her courage." He looked up at Arthur, his eyes like chips of flint. "They have made this a dangerous game. It is time we showed them how it is played by those who have nothing left to fear." The spoils of their dangerous game lay scattered across the bookbinder's table, a laptop displaying the chilling video of Serafina and Dr. Alban, printouts of offshore bank transfers, and architectural plans for the Chateau de Courcelles. They had the what, the how, and the when. They had enough evidence to send Elias and Serafina to prison for a very long time. Yet as Julian stared at the mosaic of their treachery, A profound sense of incompleteness gnawed at him. "It's not enough," he said the words, surprising even himself. Arthur looked up from a spreadsheet he was cross-referencing, his brow furrowed. "Julian, this is a prosecutor's dream. We have them on fraud, conspiracy, embezzlement. We have visual confirmation of a plot to falsely imprison you. In what world is this not enough?" "In the world of the human heart," Julian replied, his gaze distant. "Elias. His motive is pathetic but simple. Greed, envy, the suffocating weight of my shadow. I understand it. But Serafina, this is too intricate, too patient, too filled with a personal venom for it to be merely about money. Her hatred has the quality of a vintage wine. It has aged for a very long time. We have exposed her plan, but we do not yet understand her soul. And until we do, we are still fighting in the dark." He was right. They had a collection of facts, but they lacked the central truth that would transform those facts into a story. A story so powerful, it would not just convict them in a court of law, but in the court of public opinion, and most importantly, in the private court of their own minds. "The first recording," Julian said suddenly. "The one from under her desk. Play it again, Arthur. The part where she is angry after the server incident." Arthur, trusting Julian's instinct, found the audio file. He isolated the section, filtering out the background noise. Serafina's voice, tight with fury, once again filled the workshop. "Incompetent fools. An entire floor of tech geniuses." Then came the line they had overlooked in the initial shock of the larger conspiracy. After complaining about the staff, her voice had dropped to a venomous whisper, a private thought spoken aloud. "But it doesn't matter. This family has owed my father's ghost a debt for 40 years. It is time to collect." The words hung in the air. My father's ghost. A cold shock entirely different from the pain of betrayal went through Julian. It was the icy touch of a memory buried for half a lifetime under layers of success and willful forgetting. 40 years. A debt. A ghost. "My diaries," he whispered. "Arthur, in my study at the penthouse in the bottom drawer of the desk, there is a set of leather-bound books. I need them. All of them." It was a risk sending Arthur back into the lion's den, but it was one they had to take. An hour later, a breathless courier, an old trusted contact of Arthur's, delivered a heavy, dust-covered box to the workshop. Inside were 20 volumes, Julian's personal journals, one for every year, from the founding of the company until Eleanor's death. With the meticulous focus of a historian searching for a single crucial fact, Julian began to search. He did not look at the recent volumes filled with the fog of his grief, but at the early ones. He ran his fingers over the dates, traveling back in time, back to when the company was young and hungry and he along with it. Back to 40 years ago. He found it in the volume from 1985. The pages were filled with his younger self's confident looping script. He wrote of new fabric suppliers, of a triumphant show in Milan, of Eleanor's brilliant ideas for a new marketing campaign. And then an entry dated October 12th. The name leaped off the page. Henri Dubois. As he read, the ghost Serafina had spoken of took form. Henri Dubois had been their fiercest competitor, the owner of a rival textile house. He was a man of passion and flair, but he lacked the ruthless business acumen of Julian's father. The diary entry recounted with a touch of youthful arrogance the final move in a long and brutal corporate war. Julian's father had orchestrated a hostile takeover, leveraging debt-poaching key staff and bleeding Dubois Textiles dry until it collapsed. Julian read on the memory, now returning with a sickening clarity. He remembered the aftermath. The newspapers had been merciless. Henri Dubois, bankrupt and publicly humiliated, had become a cautionary tale. Julian recalled seeing him once, months later, a gray, broken man on a street corner, stripped of his pride and his purpose. He had felt a pang of something, pity, perhaps even guilt, but he had been a young man on the ascent, and the world has little time for the fallen. He had looked away and kept climbing. He flipped to the end of the diary, an appendix, a list of assets acquired from the Dubois liquidation, and there it was, a name that made the blood freeze in his veins: Château de Courcelles. It had been the Dubois family home for generations, a property they had been forced to sell for a fraction of its worth to cover their debts. Julian looked up from the diary, his face pale. He finally understood. "Her name," he said, his voice a hoarse whisper. "It isn't Dubois by chance. It is Dubois by design. Serafina is Henri Dubois' daughter." The final piece of the puzzle slid into place, and the picture it completed was one of breathtaking multi-generational malice. This was never about modernizing a brand. It was about avenging a father. She hadn't seduced Elias merely for his power. She had targeted him because he was a Vance, a tool to gain entry into the dynasty that had destroyed her own. She wasn't just planning to sell the company. She was planning to perform a ritualistic execution, inflicting the same public ruin on the Vances that they had inflicted on the Duboises. The purchase of the chateau was not a mere indulgence. It was the symbolic final act of reclamation. She was taking back her father's home with the Vances' own money. The devil's due. Arthur murmured the phrase, clicking into place. She wasn't speaking metaphorically. She was balancing a ledger 40 years in the making. Julian finished. He looked at Isabel's sketchbook, then at Arthur's dossier, then at his own father's cold, triumphant words in the diary. He saw the pattern, the long, tangled threads of ambition and revenge that connected them all. Isabel destroyed by Robert's jealousy. Henri Dubois destroyed by his father's ruthlessness. And now Seraphina, the inheritor of that pain, seeking to destroy them all in return. He realized then that he held a weapon far more potent than financial records or secret recordings. He held the source of her power, the very core of her identity, her secret. To expose Elias's fraud would be to expose a common criminal. But to expose Seraphina's vendetta would be to unmask a tragic obsessive figure, a woman so consumed by the ghosts of the past that she had sacrificed her own future to appease them. It would shatter her image of the cool, untouchable strategist. It would reveal her to Elias not as his partner in ambition, but as his manipulator, a woman who saw him as nothing more than a key to a locked room. It would utterly destroy her. Julian slowly closed the diary. The weariness, the grief, the uncertainty that had plagued him for years was gone, burned away by a cold, absolute certainty. The ghost of Henri Dubois had been avenged by his daughter. The ghost of Isabelle Moreau would now be avenged by hers. And he, Julian Vance, would no longer be a passive participant in the sins of his family. He would be the arbiter of its redemption. He looked at Arthur and then at Lena, who had been watching him. Her young face a mirror of his own grim understanding. She has given us the narrative. Julian said, his voice calm, steady, and resonant with the authority he had long forgotten he possessed. We will not just present evidence, we will tell a story, and it will be the story of her undoing. The bookbinder's workshop, once a refuge, now became a war room. The scent of old paper and glue was replaced by the electric tang of ozone from overworked laptops and the sharp metallic taste of impending conflict. The final 48 hours were not a time for fear or doubt, but for the cold, precise architecture of a perfect checkmate. Julian, a man reborn from the ashes of his own complacency, moved with an energy that belied his years. The stoop was gone from his shoulders, the fog from his eyes. He was once again the grandmaster who had built an empire, seeing the whole board, anticipating every move, and preparing a trap so elegant in its construction that his opponents would not realize its jaws had closed until it was too late. They expect a legal fight. Julian began, his voice cutting through the morning silence of the workshop. He stood before a large corkboard where Arthur had pinned photos of their adversaries and diagrams of the corporate structure. They are prepared for lawyers and accountants. They are not prepared for a story. That is where we will destroy them. The plan he outlined was not a frontal assault, but a campaign of surgical strikes aimed at the foundations of their power, Elias's ego, and Seraphina's carefully constructed image. First, the board. Julian instructed, his finger tapping on a list of names. I will call an emergency meeting. The pretense will be my final emotional appeal regarding the Omnicorp signing. He looked at Arthur. There are 6 members on the executive board. 2 are Elias's men. 4, however. 4 of them remember what it was to build this company with me. We will appeal not to their wallets, but to their memories. The invitations were sent via Julian's personal courier, not corporate email. They were printed on his heavy watermarked stationery, signed in his own hand. They spoke of a matter of grave personal and historical importance to the future of Vance Atelier, and requested their presence 1 hour before the Omnicorp signing in the private dining room adjacent to the main boardroom. And we will have other guests, Julian continued, a dangerous glint in his eye. Arthur, I need you to extend 2 very special, very discreet invitations. The first was to Geneviève Dubois, No relation to Serafina, a delicious irony, the famously incisive senior business correspondent for Le Monde. A woman known as Le Scalpel for her ability to dissect corporate fraud with ruthless precision. The second was to Monsieur Laurent, the chief curator of 20th century fashion at the Musée des Arts Décoratifs, the most respected historian of Parisian couture in the world. They will be told only that a significant piece of fashion history is about to be discussed, Julien explained. Their presence will be our unseen artillery. While the invitations were dispatched, Arthur set about preparing the bait. He met an old contact, a mid-level accountant at Vance Atelier named Pascal, a man whose career Elias had stalled and who harbored a quiet resentment. In a crowded bistro over a lunch of steak frite, Arthur played his part to perfection. He was the worried friend concerned for a former boss who was not himself. Julien is in a state. Arthur sighed, shaking his head with practiced sorrow. He's found some minor accounting errors, probably nothing clerical mistakes, and has convinced himself it's a conspiracy. He's talking about honor and legacy. He's planning to make an emotional scene at a board meeting he's called. It will be a disaster. He'll make a fool of himself. Pascal, as Arthur knew, he would dutifully reported the conversation to his superiors within the hour. The news reached Elias and Serafina as they were enjoying champagne in their sterile apartment. The narrative cuts to their perspective, revealing their hubris in its full glory. "He's found clerical mistakes," Elias mocked, swirling his champagne with a triumphant smirk. "The old fool is thrashing in the net, an emotional scene perfect. It will be the final public confirmation of Dr. Albin's diagnosis." "Let him." Serafina purred, her confidence absolute. She was reclined on a white sofa, the picture of untouchable grace. Let him rant about the good old days. Let him cry about his precious legacy. It is the most beautiful gift he could give us. You will be the calm, rational son, gently guiding his confused father from the stage. The board will be moved by your compassion. The press, if they even catch wind of it, will report on the sad, inevitable decline of a great man. And our hands will be sparkling clean. They were so entranced by the story they had written for themselves that they failed to question the script. They saw Julien's move, not as a gambit, but as a final pathetic spasm before the end. Back in the workshop, the final preparations were underway. Arthur distilled his dossier of complex financial crimes into a single, devastatingly simple one-page summary designed to be understood in 60 seconds. Julien, meanwhile, did not rehearse a speech. Instead, he sat with Isabelle's sketchbook, absorbing every line, every note, every drop of her stolen genius, until her story was as much a part of him as his own. Lena was their silent anchor. In the midst of their strategic storm, she was the quiet eye of the hurricane. She watched them, her gaze steady, a silent guardian of the justice they were about to enact. The night before the meeting, as Julien stood staring out the workshop window at the sleeping city, she approached him. She held out her hand. On her small palm lay the folded scrap of black silk. "You should have this tomorrow," she said quietly. "For my mother." Julien's throat tightened. He took the fragile piece of fabric, its texture a familiar ghost against his skin. It was not just a piece of evidence. It was a standard, a battle flag. "She would be proud of you, Lena," he said, his voice thick with emotion. "More than you will ever know." "She knows," Lena replied with a simple, unshakable certainty. The morning of the confrontation dawned gray and overcast the sky the color of polished steel. There was no more planning to be done. The pieces were all on the board, poised for the final bloody exchange. Arthur arrived at dawn, his face set like stone. Lena, dressed in a simple but new dress Julien had bought for her, looked like a child again, but her eyes held the gravity of an old soul. Julien emerged from the back room of the workshop last. The transformation was absolute. The frail, shuffling old man of the past week was gone. In his place stood Julien Vance, the founder, the visionary, the lion. He wore a bespoke suit of charcoal gray, the kind he had not worn in years, its sharp lines a statement of intent. His silver hair was perfectly coiffed. His eyes, clear and focused, held the cold fire of a man who had made peace with the cost of victory. In the breast pocket of his suit, the black silk of the black orchid was just visible, a dark flower blooming over his heart. He did not speak. He simply nodded to Arthur and Lena. They drove in silence through the waking streets of Paris, a trinity of ghosts on their way to an exorcism. The Vence Atelier building loomed before them, a tower of glass and steel that had once been Julien's monument and had become his prison. Today it would be a courthouse. Arthur pulled the car into a private underground entrance. As they walked toward the elevator, the air humming with the latent power of the building, Julien felt a profound and liberating calm. The fear was gone. The doubt was gone. The grief for a moment was held at bay by the crystal-clear purity of his purpose. The game was over. All that remained was to announce the checkmate. The private dining room at Vence Atelier was a chamber of quiet opulence, a place where fortunes were decided over coffee and croissants. Today, it was a courtroom in waiting. The 4 loyal board members sat around the polished mahogany table, their faces a mixture of confusion and concern. At a small table to the side, Geneviève Dubois-Le Scalpel of Le Monde sat with an air of professional impatience, her pen poised over a notebook. Beside her, Monsieur Laurent from the Musée des Arts Décoratifs adjusted his spectacles, his curiosity piqued. Julien stood by the window, a silent, motionless figure looking down on the city. Arthur was a discreet presence by the door, a granite statue of vigilance. In a simple chair near the window, almost blending into the shadows, sat Lena. She held a small, worn copy of The Count of Monte Cristo, but she wasn't reading. She was watching. At precisely 10 o'clock, the doors opened. Elias and Serafina made their entrance. They were a vision of power. Elias in a dark, razor-sharp suit, Serafina in a cream-colored dress that was both elegant and severe. They moved with the easy confidence of victors arriving to accept a surrender. "Gentlemen," Elias began, his voice smooth and commanding as he surveyed the board members. "Thank you for coming on such short notice. I know my uncle wished to speak with you. I'm sure we are all eager to hear what is on his mind." His gaze swept past Julien with a flicker of condescending pity. Serafina's smile was a masterpiece of sympathetic concern. "Julien, darling," she said, her voice soft. "We are all here for you. Please take your time." They believed they were setting the stage for his final pathetic performance. They had no idea they were walking onto a scaffold of their own construction. Julien turned from the window. The transformation was breathtaking. The shuffling, hesitant old man was gone. In his place stood a titan. His posture was ramrod straight. His eyes burned with a cold, clear light, and his presence filled the room with an authority that had been dormant, not dead. A stunned silence fell. "Thank you all for coming," Julien said, his voice not the weak tremor they expected, but the resonant baritone of a commander. "We are here today to discuss the soul of this company, a soul which I have discovered was stolen long ago and was about to be sold for parts." He did not look at Elias or Serafina. He looked at Monsieur Laurent. "Monsieur, if you would be so kind." Arthur stepped forward and placed Isabelle's sketchbook on the table before the curator. Puzzled, Laurent opened it. The effect was instantaneous and profound. The curator, a man who had handled the rarest and most beautiful objects in the world, drew in a sharp, audible breath. He stared at the first page, his professional composure dissolving into pure, unadulterated awe. He lifted a page with hands that trembled slightly, as if he were touching a holy relic. "Mon Dieu." He whispered the words a prayer. He looked up at the room, his eyes wide with the shock of discovery. This is the work of a master. The anatomical precision, the revolutionary use of silhouette. This is not just a collection. This is a new language in fashion. He turned a page, his wonder growing. The Black Orchid. I have studied the archives. The official story credits Robert Vance with the design concept. But this is the hand of a singular genius. This is the source. The uncredited foundational text of Vance Atelier. He looked directly at Julien. Where did this come from? It is the work of a designer named Isabelle Moreau. Julien said, his voice ringing with clarity. A young woman of prodigious talent who was dismissed from this company 40 years ago, her work stolen, her name erased from history. The board members murmured, confused and shocked. Elias's smile had frozen on his face. Serafina's expression was a mask of ice, but a flicker of unease appeared in her eyes. Julien then turned to the journalist. "Mademoiselle Dubois," he said, handing her Arthur's one-page summary. "Perhaps your expertise can shed some light on the more contemporary aspects of our company's management." Genevieve's eyes scanned the page. The languid curiosity vanished, replaced by the sharp-focused intensity of a shark scenting blood. Her gaze snapped up to Elias. Monsieur Vance. She began, her voice cutting like a razor. This document lists 17 shell corporations registered in Panama, all linked to a holding company in your name. It details wire transfers totaling over 20 million euros from Vance Atelier's primary accounts to these corporations over the past 2 years. The listed vendor services for these transfers include synergistic brand consulting and dynamic market analysis. Can you tell me the name of the firm that provided these services? Elias was completely blindsided. This was not the sentimental rambling he had prepared for. This was a surgical strike. That is confidential corporate information. He stammered, his composure beginning to fray. A routine matter of asset diversification. So you do not deny the existence of these companies? Genevieve pressed her pen, flying across her notepad. This is an ambush, Serafina interjected, her voice sharp. My fiancé will not be subjected to this tabloid interrogation. Then perhaps you can answer, Julian said, turning the full force of his attention on her. He nodded to Arthur. Let us review your more recent creative endeavors. The large screen on the wall intended for the Omnicorp presentation flickered to life. The audio came first, Serafina's cool, clear voice filling the room. This family has owed my father's ghost a debt for 40 years. It is time to collect. The room fell into a deathly silence. Elias stared at Serafina, a dawning horror on his face. Then the video began. The pristine white of Serafina's office, the call with Dr. Albin. The board members watched, their faces turning from shock to disgust as they saw the falsified medical report, as they heard the cold clinical plan to have their chairman declared mentally incompetent and shipped to Switzerland. This is doctored footage, Elias shouted, his voice cracking with panic. Slander, lies. But the proof was absolute, the betrayal undeniable. The 4 loyal board members were staring at him with undisguised contempt. He had not only tried to defraud them, he had tried to bury the man who had built the very table they were sitting at. Then Julian delivered the final killing blow. He did not raise his voice. He spoke with the quiet, devastating finality of a judge passing sentence. The ghost of your father, Serafina. He said, his eyes locking onto hers. Let us speak of him. Henri Dubois. A good designer, but a poor businessman. My father ruined him. A tragedy, one of many in the brutal world of business. You have spent your entire life plotting to avenge him, to inflict the same ruin on my family that mine inflicted on yours. He took a step toward Elias, who now looked between Julian and Serafina like a trapped animal. She never loved you, Elias. Julian said, his voice laced with a terrible pity. She despised you. You were nothing but a key. A dull, foolish instrument to be used to unlock the doors of the family that had wronged her. She wasn't building a future with you. She was settling a debt using your name, your power, and your boundless, pathetic ego. It was a vivisection of the soul performed in public. Every word was true, and in that truth their entire world collapsed. Serafina's mask of serene control did not just crack, it exploded. The cold architect was gone, replaced by a cornered fury. He deserved it, she shrieked, her voice raw and ugly. Your family of thieves. You build your empire on the bones of men like my father, and you lecture me about honor. You used me, Elias whispered, staring at her as if seeing her for the first time. The realization was a physical blow, a hollowing out of everything he thought he knew. All of it. It was all a lie. Of course it was a lie, you idiot, Serafina spat at him, her hatred now unleashed on her closest ally. Did you really think I was impressed by you? The whining prince who could never measure up? You were a means to an end? At that precise moment, the grand doors to the main boardroom swung open. A delegation of stern-faced executives from Omnicorp stood on the threshold, their expressions of polite anticipation curdling into shock as they took in the scene: a screaming woman, a shattered man, and a room full of horrified board members. The lead executive, a severe-looking man with a portfolio in hand, took one look at the implosion and made his decision. This meeting is concluded, he said curtly. The Omnicorp offer is hereby withdrawn. As he spoke, two plainclothed men and a woman entered discreetly from a side door, their badges hanging from their necks. Arthur had made the call 10 minutes ago. Elias Vance Serafina Dubois. The lead officer said, her voice calm but unbreakable. You are under arrest on suspicion of conspiracy to commit fraud, embezzlement, and forgery. The click of the handcuffs was a small final sound in the now silent room. Serafina did not struggle. She simply stared at Julian, her face a mask of pure, unadulterated hatred. Elias, on the other hand, seemed to collapse inward, the last of his arrogant bluster vanishing, leaving only a hollowed-out shell of a man. As they were led away, a fallen king and a dethroned queen of a shadow empire, Julian stood amidst the wreckage. He felt no triumph, only the grim, aching satisfaction of a necessary amputation. The cancer had been cut out. The house had been cleansed. His gaze found Lena, still sitting quietly in the corner. She had not moved, had not made a sound throughout the entire ordeal. She simply watched, her solemn eyes the only true point of stillness in the chaotic room. He had won. He had saved his company. He had exposed the traitors. But most importantly, as the world would soon learn from Geneviève Dubois' front-page story, he had given Isabelle Moreau back her name. 6 months later, the air in Paris crackled with a different kind of energy. The name Vance was on everyone's lips, but the story was not the sordid tale of fraud and betrayal Serafina had intended. Instead, thanks to Geneviève Dubois' masterful front-page exposé in Le Monde, it had become a legend of redemption, of a lost genius, rediscovered, of a king reclaiming his soul. The fall of the House of Vance had been averted. In its place was a resurrection. The Vance Atelier building was still a monument, but it was no longer a tomb. Light and life had been poured back into its marble veins. The sterile white and chrome of Serafina's reign had been replaced with warm woods, rich textiles, and vibrant displays of the company's archives. The heart of the company was beating once more. At the center of it all was Julian. The world saw a man rejuvenated, a titan of industry who had rediscovered the fire of his youth. And it was true. The battle had stripped away the weariness, the grief, the comfortable detachment. He was sharp, engaged, and present in a way he had not been in years. But he was also a changed man. The arrogance of his youth had been replaced by a quiet humility, his ruthlessness tempered by a profound understanding of his own fallibility. He now ruled not as a solitary king, but as a chief steward entrusted with a legacy that was both his and not his. The culmination of this new era was set for the opening night of Paris Fashion Week. Vance Atelier was presenting a special collection, an event that had become the most anticipated in the city's recent history. The show was not titled with a season or a number. It was called simply Isabelle's Dream. Backstage was a universe of controlled chaos. Racks of breathtaking garments stood ready, models were in the final stages of hair and makeup, and the air hummed with the electric tension of creation about to be revealed. Julian moved through it all with a calm authority, his eye catching every detail. He found Lena standing before a full-length mirror. She was no longer the ghost from the rain. She was a poised, intelligent young girl dressed in a simple but elegant navy blue dress that he had designed for her himself. She was not a model or a mascot, but the guest of honor, the living heart of the evening's tribute. He had officially become her legal guardian a month prior, a quiet affair in a judge's chambers that felt more significant than any corporate contract he had ever signed. "Are you nervous?" he asked, his voice soft. She looked at his reflection in the mirror, her moss-green eyes as steady as ever. "No, I am proud. Tonight everyone will know her name." She looked down at the small leather-bound sketchbook she held in her hands. This was her dream. "You are making it real." "She made it real, Lena," Julian corrected her gently. "We are just finally opening the world's eyes to it." When the show began, a hush fell over the packed audience of fashion elite critics and celebrities. The first model walked onto the runway, not in a new design but in a perfect, painstakingly recreated version of the black orchid gown. It was a statement of intent, an acknowledgement of the past before venturing into the future. What followed was a revelation. One by one, the designs from Isabelle's sketchbook came to life. It was a collection of staggering beauty and innovation. There were gowns that seemed spun from moonlight and starlight, inspired by her sketches of celestial maps. There were dresses that flowed with the impossible grace of deep-sea creatures, using fabrics and techniques that felt decades ahead of their time. It was not just clothing. It was art, a testament to a genius that had been silenced for too long. For the finale, Julian himself walked onto the runway. He did not bow. He stood before the audience, a phalanx of models in Isabel's incredible creations arrayed behind him, and he spoke. For 40 years, he began, his voice clear and strong, resonating through the vast space. I have accepted credit for a legacy that was only half mine. Vance's atelier was built on 2 hearts, 2 souls. One was mine. The other belonged to a brilliant visionary artist named Isabel Moreau. He told them the whole story. He spoke of her genius, of his brother's jealousy, of his own unforgivable blindness. He did not make excuses or soften the edges of the injustice. He laid the truth bare for the world to see. Tonight we correct the historical record, he declared. The soul of this company is being returned to its rightful owner, and to ensure that no other young genius is ever silenced, that no other voice is ever erased, I am announcing the formation of the Isabel Moreau Foundation. He explained that all the money recovered from Elias and Serafina's accounts, over 20 million euros, would be the initial endowment. The foundation would provide scholarships and grants to young, unheralded designers from underprivileged backgrounds, giving them the support and the platform that Isabel had been so cruelly denied. He finished his speech by turning to the side of the stage where Lena stood watching. And the foundation's honorary chair and final vote on all decisions will be the keeper of the legacy, the guardian of the dream, her daughter Lena. The applause that erupted was not the polite clapping of a fashion show. It was a thunderous, sustained roar of genuine emotion. It was an ovation for Isabel, for Julian's honesty, for the small, solemn girl who had become the symbol of a great wrong, finally made right. Later, long after the crowds had departed, leaving behind the scent of champagne and the buzz of a legendary evening, Julian and Lena stood alone in the now silent atelier. Before them, on a single mannequin, stood the black orchid gown, its dark silk seeming to drink in the shadows. Julian looked at the dress, then at the sketchbook Lena was still holding. His entire life he had been a creator, a builder of tangible things. But he saw now that a true legacy was not built of fabric and thread, or glass and steel. It was built of truth. It was measured in the promises you kept and the wrongs you were willing to right. Elias and Serafina were footnotes. Now their names already fading, their story, a cautionary tale of greed and soulless ambition. They were serving long prison sentences, their assets forfeited, their bitter recriminations against each other echoing in sterile prison cells. They had tried to steal a fortune and an empire, but in the end, they had only lost themselves. Julian had lost his company and found it again. He had lost his family and in the most unexpected way built a new one. He had looked into the abyss of his own past, at the sins of his father and his brother, at his own failings, and had chosen not to turn away but to atone. He reached out and placed his hand on Lena's shoulder. They stood together in silence. 2 survivors, a foundling girl and an old lion, guardians of a dream that had been deferred but never destroyed. The house of Vance had not fallen. It had been rebuilt on a foundation stronger than any marble, more valuable than any silk. It had been rebuilt on justice. In the years that followed, the Isabel Moreau Foundation flourished, becoming a powerful force in the world of design, launching the careers of dozens of brilliant young artists who otherwise would have remained in the shadows. Lena, under Julian's guidance, grew into a formidable young woman, possessing her mother's artistic soul and Julian's strategic mind. She did not become a designer herself, but the powerful and visionary head of the foundation, ensuring that her mother's legacy was not a single static collection, but a constantly evolving force for creativity and fairness. Julian Vance lived to see the company he had founded become more innovative, more respected, and more soulful than it had ever been. He learned that the greatest act of creation is not in building something new, but in having the courage to repair what is broken. He learned that family is not always the blood you are born with, but the people you choose to fight for. And that a true legacy is not a name carved in stone, but a story whispered with reverence, a story of a ghost who was finally given a voice, and of a lion who learned at the end of his life that the greatest strength is found in humility. Thank you for joining us on this journey. If this story of justice and redemption resonated with you, we would be honored if you would like this video and subscribe to our channel for more tales that explore the depths of the human heart and the enduring power of truth. Your support allows us to continue telling stories that matter.